Welcome to the second UFM Lou Douglas lecture of this academic year. I'm Marsha Horning, and I'm a board member of UFM Community Learning Center and also a member of the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Steering Committee. Linda Tiener, UFM's executive director, had back surgery last week, so we wish her well in a speedy recovery. So I'm kind of standing in for her this evening. Thanks for joining us for tonight's discussion. The Lou Douglas Lecture Series on Public Issues was founded to honor the memory of Professor Lou Douglas, a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State University from 1949 until 1977, who was widely known for his power to inspire students, faculty, and citizens, to instigate change and to motivate grassroots organizations and individuals to pursue social justice in politics, economics, and foreign policy. The series not only reaches the university community, but also the citizens of Manhattan and our region. The focus is consistent with the intent of the land-grant mission of Kansas State University. So following tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer period, and we invite folks to come on down to the microphones right here, and you can ask anything you'd like. A couple of other reminders. Please turn your cell phones to silent if you have them handy. And if you need to leave before the lecture's over, we ask you do so quietly so that we can hear the rest of the discussion. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Diane Swanson, Lou Douglas Steering Committee member, Professor of Management, and Edgerly Family Chair in Business Administration at Kansas State. So Dr. Swanson will introduce tonight's speaker.
Yes, I do have the great honor of introducing Mr. Goossen, and seriously, I don't know when I've ever been so interested in a lecture as I am tonight. I have been perplexed and dismayed by the news coming out of Topeka, whether I read it in the Kansas newspaper or read it elsewhere or hear it on the radio here or elsewhere. And I know I'm not the only one who is alarmed and perhaps perplexed. For instance, just 2 days ago, ABC News reported, and I'm sorry to tell you this if you haven't already heard it, but ABC News reported that a multi-million-dollar budget deficit is all but certain to emerge in Kansas, with new, more pessimistic revenue projections expected in the coming week, and I know Mr. Goossen is going to address this and much more. Prior to that, I read stories about how Kansas teachers are fleeing across the border to neighboring states due to a lack of budget support for education. And I've read that the transfers of budget from the highway department threaten Kansas road systems. I don't know what President Eisenhower would be thinking if he were here right now, given that the interstate highway system was put into place during his administration, and Kansas claims to be the first state to break ground in that historic road system event. So I have heard many observers conclude that the new tax burden in Kansas has clearly been shifted to the middle class and working poor. So my tentative conclusion, my working hypothesis is that we're living in a time when there is a rendering of the long-term social contract between Kansas residents and their ruling body, the state legislature. That's my working hypothesis, that this long-standing social contract between citizens of Kansas and the rulemaking body is being altered radically. And since this is a university and we advocate critical thinking, that's just a tentative hypothesis. I'm willing to entertain new information and new perspectives. And there's no one better than to give this than Mr. Goossen. He served as state budget director in Kansas for 12 years in the administrations of 3 governors, Republican Bill Graves and Democrats Kathleen Sebelius and Mark Patterson. This is someone who has worked in a bipartisan way. And Mr. Goossen received the National Association of State Budget Officers Gloria Timmer Award for Career Achievements in a State Budget Office. I looked this up today. It's a very prestigious award, national award, and it's given for significant and positive impact on the fiscal situation of the award recipient state. We need that more than ever now, that kind of leadership, I would posit. Mr. Goossen represented Marion and Chase counties for 7 terms in the Kansas House of Representatives. I think you can see that he's uniquely situated to address what's happening in Topeka at this moment in time. He graduated from Bethel College in North Newton, Kansas, and he holds a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Mr. Goossen currently writes and speaks about the Kansas budget and state finance situation as a senior fellow with the Kansas Center for Economic Growth. Clearly, he is in a unique position to present an incredibly informed perspective tonight on the fiscal situation in this state. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Goossen tonight.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Swanson, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here tonight. The Lou Douglas Lecture Series has a long history of bringing progressive and provocative speakers to the K-State campus, and I'm very appreciative and honored to be invited to be part of that. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments at the conclusion of my remarks. It's, of course, great to be on the K-State campus. This afternoon I had the opportunity to speak and have a really good discussion with Dr. Jim Chereau's Kansas history class. And my niece, Maura Thiessen, is a first-year student here in product design. And as I look around here in this room, I realize that there are lots of people here that I know. How many of you are K-State students? Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much for coming. Well, thank you all for coming. Students, Kansans, all of you. But I've got to ask, and be honest with me, did you know that you were coming to a lecture with the word budget in the title? I mean, who does that? Budgets are often thought to be boring things. And I can tell you, I've given many lectures on state finances, and to have a talk on the state budget on a Tuesday night in November, well, in the past, that would have been very difficult to get anybody to come if you'd even have an invitation to do such a thing. I'm also assuming that we owe a bit of a debt to the quick win of the Kansas City Royals for tonight's attendance, because if the World Series had gone to Game 6, Game 6 would have been beginning just about right now. So, hey, way to go, Royals. But still, even without the competition of a big sporting event, you've come to a lecture on the state budget. Something is different now. The Kansas budget has become a topic of some emotion and notoriety. The Kansas budget, as Dr. Swanson suggested, is national news. Virtually every major news outlet in our country and and also in other countries, has carried multiple stories and columns on the Kansas budget of all things. And they continue to report and watch to see what might happen next. You know, I wish the Kansas budget were more mundane, boring, not able to attract anybody to hear about it. I wish we were more in the mainstream of where other states are. But we as Kansans have allowed our budget to dangerously slip out of the normal zone and become an object of controversy. A budget's a plan for how we spend our money. And as a result, it usually reflects our deepest values as a society, because we spend our money on the things we value. But in Kansas, I believe we have let the state budget depart from representing our core values. I am currently a Shawnee County resident. I live in Topeka. But for many years, I lived in the small town of Gossel, Kansas, which is in the southwest part of Marion County. It's about 2 hours south of here. I graduated from high school there. I operated a construction business. I was a volunteer fireman, and I gained my first elected political experience on the Gossel City Council, later representing Gossel and Marion County in the Kansas House. Gossel's a town of about 500 people, but has a larger community, a rural community that feeds into it. And on the side of the grocery store is a mural with the words, "Small town, big heart." And that is exactly how our family experienced that community when we lived there. I very much miss walking down the main street of Gossel and having people drive by and putting their hand up in a wave and greeting from the steering wheel. Gossel has a school district with about 280 students. 2 years ago, the community passed a bond issue to renovate portions of the school buildings, and the bond issue passed with a 95% yes vote. There are multiple reasons that the bond issue passed that overwhelmingly, but one of them is that the community understands how vitally important that school is to the economy and fabric of the community. Gossel does not have a hospital, but it has a pretty large and very good nursing home that offers a continuum of services. That home is an anchor of local jobs and economic health. State Highway 15 connects Gossel to Newton and Wichita to the south and other communities to the north. State Highway 215 comes from K15 on into town and forms Gossel's Main Street. Many of the people who live in Gossel work in other places, which makes that highway link very critical to the community's success. The town has a sewer and a water system that over the years has benefited from various kinds of development programs that help build and maintain infrastructure like that. Education, health services, a highway, infrastructure, they're vital to that community. The people of Gossel understand that. Now, you all come from different communities, probably most bigger, maybe a lot bigger, some smaller. There are varying makeups in the communities that you come from. But I'm certain that all of you also instinctively understand how important these basic things, education, health services, roads, and infrastructure, are to economic health and sustainability and growth. Gossel's a conservative place. You will not find people there who want state government to overspend or overreach. But they are practical. They want things to work. And through it all, they're a small town with a big heart. And I've come to think of that as a metaphor for Kansas and traditional Kansas values. Those values: invest in education, have good highways, keep a big heart, give a friendly wave, be practical, help out your neighbor. Those values no longer guide the Kansas budget. Our budget has instead become focused on cutting back, disinvesting, and squeezing down critically important items to fit within a diminishing revenue stream. Perhaps this is a good time to pause for just a minute and let's do a little bit of state budget background. I hope that you will indulge me in this. I won't be long, but just a few minutes of background. Kansas has a budget with two main funds: the Highway Fund and the General Fund. When we're talking about the Kansas budget, that's essentially what we're talking about. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But for tonight, we can just concentrate on the essence. The Highway Fund is for highways and roads. At least that's what it's supposed to be. And it gets its money from fuel taxes that we all pay, from vehicle registrations fees. The federal government contributes some money, and a small portion of the sales tax that we pay feed in. And the state operates a system with about 10,000 miles of roads. And it takes a lot to keep that up. The General Fund is where most of our state tax dollars go, and the fund that lawmakers have the most discretion over. And the chart that you see now outlines how general fund dollars are currently allocated. Half go to support the 286 school districts that make up kindergarten through 12th grade public education. Those school districts range from big to little. Another 12% supports higher education. K-State. 17 or almost 18% pays for the Kansas share of Medicaid. Medicaid is a terribly important health program for low-income Kansans that covers health services for about 400,000 Kansans, most of whom are children. More than half of the people who live in Kansas nursing homes are supported there by the Medicaid program. The federal government pays the majority of the costs, but Kansas has to pay a portion. Another 9% goes for other human services, foster care, public health, state hospitals. 6%, that's the yellow slice there, covers public safety, which is mostly our prison system, and then there are some smaller slices after that. But the key point, 90% of our state general fund dollars are allocated for education or human services in some way. So if the budget is being squeezed down, as it is now, human services and education programs are going to suffer. Now, let's look at a slide which shows where we currently get the money to pay for the general fund. You can see that the big two items are individual income tax and sales tax, with a smaller set of items, severance tax on oil and gas, some tobacco and liquor taxes, and some others. But the big two are sales and income. The focus of Kansas tax policy right now is to get rid of the individual income tax. Sometimes that's been referred to as the march to zero. Income tax used to provide about 50% of the cost of funding the state general fund. And you can see that that has now slipped, and sales and use tax have become the dominant source. One final thing on budget background, and that's the rule of the Kansas budget. The Kansas budget is controlled by the same rule that guides our own personal finances. Kansas cannot spend more than it has. Revenue or income must at least equal expenditures. If there's money in the bank, then those savings can be used to temporarily cover a period when income falls below expenses. Ultimately, though, income and outgo, they have to match, they have to balance. That's very different from how the federal government operates. The federal government almost always spends more than it takes in and makes up the difference by borrowing money. Kansas cannot do that. If revenue goes down, then something else has to give. So what's happened? Let's think first about expenses. Let's go back to this chart. Think about the items that Kansas spends money on. Without doing anything new, just trying to provide the same services year after year, same thing, will expenses also stay the same? Will we spend the same amount of money? No. What does it take to run a public school? Electricity, salaries, bus transportation, school supplies, technology. Even without factoring in that the student population in Kansas is growing, it's not hard to imagine that input costs are rising. And that same thing is true for Medicaid. Healthcare costs go up every year. It's also true for highways, also true for higher education. You know, at one time, you could buy a bottle of soda for 10 cents, or a new pair of blue jeans for a couple of dollars, or a new car for a few $1,000s. But not today. Costs rise over time. It's completely unrealistic for people who put budgets together to plan that spending will always be the same or even go down. In fact, if spending is the same year after year after year after year, as costs are rising, that means that somehow services are actually going down, the services that are delivered. Over time, costs go up. And in a reasonably balanced system, income would rise as costs go up. People would earn more and pay more income tax. As the cost of goods goes up, people would buy more things and pay more sales tax. And as costs rise, income would rise with it, and the system would be reasonably or almost balanced. Kansas, however, is not on a path like that right now, different from almost every other state. 4 years ago, Kansas started its march to zero on individual income taxes. We started that path with dramatic income tax rate cuts and a policy that entirely exempted individuals with business income from paying any income tax at all. In this next slide, you can see where the tax rates on income tax used to be. In 2012, top rate 6.45% of income. Now that has been reduced to 4.6% by now. And individuals who receive business income through a limited liability corporation or through rental income or farm income or self-employment income, they don't pay income tax on that income at all. So what happens if you exempt a whole bunch of income from tax entirely and you drastically lower the rates on the income that people do pay on? What happens? Revenue goes down. That shouldn't be a surprise. At the time, though, the change in tax policy was sold as something that would generate supercharged economic activity that would in turn bring in more tax money to replace the income lost through the tax cuts. Now, that sounds awesome. Cut taxes, but still get the same amount of money. It's an incredibly seductive argument. For those of you who are students and working a job, it's like saying you can quit that job and you'll still have enough money to fund your education. If you're on a diet, it's like saying you can eat more and you'll still lose weight. If you're a farmer, you don't have to plant the whole field. Plant half as much as what you planted last year, but you'll still get the same crop yield. It sounds great. It sounds wonderful. But it does not work. Yet, the majority of our Kansas lawmakers bought it. And in the first full year of implementation, revenue fell $700 million. And then it kept falling. Expenses were up here, and revenue fell here. And remember the rule of the Kansas budget. Kansas can't spend more than it has. So what happened? How did the state fill that gap between expenses up here and revenue down here? In the first 2 years, Kansas went through its entire savings and bank account to fund that gap between the two. That still wasn't enough. Lawmakers also cut programs, they pulled expenses down, and they reached into the highway fund and pulled money out of the highway fund and pulled it over to the general fund in order to try to somehow make things balance. But that was a short-term solution, because last year lawmakers arrived in Topeka for the 2015 legislative session, and they were charged with building a budget. And they still faced a situation in which expenses for the coming year were about $800 million higher than expected income. And again, remember that rule of the Kansas budget. You can't spend more than you have. And this time, when lawmakers arrived last January, the savings, the bank account was gone. So there was nothing to fill the gap that was easy to just grab onto and pull over. Something had to give. In the end, what lawmakers did to solve that gap was to pull expenses down some more. Even though programs had already been hit a lot, they pulled expenses down some more. They raised the sales tax, they raised cigarette taxes, and then went the rest of the way to fill the gap by reaching into the highway fund and virtually every other fund in state government that had any money left in it, and pulled that money over in a one-time way and pulled it in, and by doing that, just barely eked out a balance, just barely made revenue and expenditures line up. But did that fix things going forward? No, it quelled the immediate crisis, but going forward, the budget was still balanced with one-time money that isn't ongoing, and expenses are a conservative set of expenses are still significantly higher than the ongoing revenue stream. That brings me to my key point. Kansas budget policy is focused on tax reduction, unrealistic tax reduction, not on the Kansas values, highways, education, health services that we all know to be important. Again, remember that rule of the Kansas budget. Kansas cannot spend more than it has. So as the revenue stream goes down, ultimately spending is going to have to be squeezed down to match it. And for at least some Kansas lawmakers, that's been the whole point. They want to cut programs, but it's hard to look constituents in the eye and say, I'm going to cut your schools, or I'm going to let that road you travel on every day deteriorate. But if the revenue stream diminishes, that forces spending cuts. So instead of saying, I'm going to cut your schools, the lawmaker can say, well, we have to live within our means. For lawmakers who don't like state programs, starving the revenue stream is the most effective way to knock those programs down. And whether it's intentional or not, that is exactly what has been happening in Kansas. We no longer have enough money to fund normal services. We're broke. All of our state's political energy is going into finding the lowest common denominator for our state programs, downsizing them, holding them back, doing the least possible. We're in a perpetual budget crisis. We're not looking ahead, but each year we're trying to pull back enough to just eke by. Let's look at some examples of that. The biggest obligation in state government is public education. We had been operating with a school finance formula that, in essence, gave every school district a set amount per pupil. If a student population went up, the district received more money. If a district had a growing mix of harder-to-educate students, then the district received more money. But lawmakers have scrapped that system. They've replaced it with a block grant. And under the block grant, the first thing that happened is that school district state aid got cut, and then school districts were told that they would receive that same amount of money, that amount that's already cut down, that's what they would receive next year and the year after that. Never mind that costs are going up or that the number of students might be increasing. You get what you get. That was not done because it was a fairer, more equitable way to distribute money or because that's what students needed. It was done to limit state spending on education. Second thing there, Medicaid, sometimes called CanCare. Medicaid costs go up every year, and for the most part, Kansas has very little choice but to pay the state portion of Medicaid bills. But for several years now, Kansas has had the opportunity to expand Medicaid eligibility, expand to more people with the federal government paying 100% of the cost in the first years and then 90% of the cost in later years. Expanding eligibility would not only extend health coverage to a lot more Kansans who currently don't have it, but would bring literally billions of federal dollars into the state. Yet Kansas refuses to do that. How come? At least one reason is because even that small cost in the future seems unaffordable given the current outlook for state finances. Kansas also has a very large highway system. Takes a lot to keep it up. Yet for the last 3 years, lawmakers have extensively used it for other purposes. One way that general fund expenditures have actually been brought down and kept low was by shifting the cost of school transportation, buses, from the general fund to the highway fund. So when you see a school bus driving down the road, the expense to run that bus has been cut from the general fund, but we're still paying the bill. It's just that now we're paying for it from the highway fund at the expense of road projects. Lawmakers have also simply just reached into the highway fund and taken out hundreds of millions of dollars to shore up the general fund. And that money does not come free. Transferring highway fund dollars over means that less road repair and projects are going to be done. And that's something that in the short run you may not notice, but it shows up over time, and then it's too late. Higher education has lost ground on state funding in the Great Recession, never gained it back. And it's depressing to say this on a university campus, but given our current outlook, you're never going to regain those dollars. The amount of money that K-State receives from the state is going to diminish as a percentage of K-State's overall income. It's going to diminish, and that, of course, then means that tuition and fees are going to go up. We have many dedicated state employees who engineer our roads, inspect the food we eat, check on children at risk for abuse and neglect, staff state hospitals and prisons. However, those employees have not had a raise or a general pay increase or cost of living increase for over 7 years. And there's not one in sight either. That's a direct result of the state's budget problems, and coupled with lower employee benefits and really a lack of respect from many lawmakers, it's left our state with understaffed hospitals and prisons and a poor work environment. Finally, economic development programs have suffered, and a key example of that is the Kansas Bioscience Authority, something that Manhattan and K-State have enormously benefited from in the past years. As part of the budget balancing exercise, millions of dollars have been cut away from efforts to attract and grow our state's bioscience industry. Well, perhaps that's enough examples. There are more. But none of this, none of what's happening here is a recipe for progress. Around us, other states are investing in their schools and in their infrastructure and in their future, and we're trying to find ways to cut ours back and be smaller. Here's a list of budget questions that we ought to be asking. How do we create world-class schools? How do we get the most talented people to be teachers? How do we provide opportunities that keep our graduates in Kansas? What methods will work best to keep our rural communities vibrant? How can our universities make our state more vital? Can health care be extended to all Kansans? How can we improve our investment in early childhood education? What must be done to attract the very best state workers and keep them? What should the transportation system of our future look like? How do we meet future energy needs, both cleanly and affordably? In our current political and budget context, there is no room for questions like that. But for our future, we've just got to make room. If I'd ask you, how many people in this room would like to pay lower taxes, I'd guess everyone would put their hand up. That would be normal, natural. If I would then ask, how many of you in this room value good schools, well-maintained roads, K-State, and a reasonable set of safety net programs, I wouldn't be surprised if the same set of hands goes up. Those are, or can be, somewhat contradictory notions. But our lawmakers have to hold those contradictory notions in their hands and balance them out. And we have to help them balance those notions appropriately. And we've slipped. We have allowed our lawmakers to tell us that we could pay less taxes and everything would be okay. We lost balance. Our eye came off the small town, big heart approach. We got hoodwinked. The result is a budget that does not work for Kansas. And to compound the pain, most of us did not even end up with lower taxes. Yes, in the beginning, income tax rates went down. But then, in order to stem the flow of falling revenue, sales tax went up. Then income taxes and deductions, income tax deductions and credits for those who still pay income taxes were limited. And then the sales tax went up again. Then as school districts tried to adjust to lower state aid, they raised property taxes wherever they could. The end result is that on average, lower income Kansans actually pay more than they did before. Middle income Kansans, for middle income Kansans, it's about a wash. And for upper income Kansans, well, they did okay. This is a chart which tries to show the net result of what has happened with these tax changes. And that's the bottom 40% of Kansas earners. They're on average actually paying more now as a result of all of this. The next 40%, from there to there, that's 80% of Kansans. And the next 40%, that's pretty close to a wash. And then these last three boxes, that's the upper 20% of Kansans. That's the top 1%. They did all right. And if you happen to be one of those upper income Kansans, or one of the Kansans who no longer pays any income tax, you're at least partly lucky. Because on the tax side, you may have come out okay, but you're right there with the rest of us in experiencing the downgrading of state services and our inability as a state to make any kind of future progress. The cost to our future has been high, and we are losing valuable years in this effort to downsize rather than look forward. We've got to return our focus to those bedrock values: quality public education, decent highways, reasonable health services, a small town with a big heart, and then figure out a fair taxation system to fund them. And I have no doubt that Kansas can do that, but it's going to require that citizens pay attention. Those underlying values are there, but there has been a disconnect between our traditional values and what lawmakers are actually doing. If you've not seen the recent survey called Kansas Speaks, it's put out by the Docking Institute at Fort Hays State, you should take a look. It confirms that disconnect. A strong majority of Kansans believe that our tax experiment has failed and has been costly for the things that we traditionally value. We have to fix that, and we can. As a beginning step, the revenue stream has to be fixed, has to be improved. Kansas should immediately end the income tax exemption, which allows many individuals to pay no income tax at all. Some of you in this room, you likely benefit from that exemption, and I'm sure you like it, and if you do, I completely understand that. But that exemption is not fair, and it has cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars without providing any measurable benefit. There's some talk that perhaps ending the exemption can be traded for lowering the sales tax on food. Lowering the sales tax on food is an admirable and worthy goal, because when you add in local sales tax rates, in Kansas now, we have, in many places, the highest sales tax rate on food in the nation. But we need more revenue. So ending the income tax exemption, but then equally lowering the sales tax on food, that's not going to fix the financial problems that Kansas currently is facing. The business income tax exemption should just simply be ended. It's not fair, and it's not producing results. A lower sales tax on food can perhaps be contemplated, but it probably involves raising regular income tax rates back up. And if done carefully, maybe that can work. We should immediately quit degrading teachers and figure out how to appropriately invest in schools. No issue is more important than this. Our schools are our future. And without high-quality schools, our rural areas cannot stay healthy, and our state cannot attract and retain more citizens. We should immediately expand Medicaid eligibility. And this one should be a no-brainer. Expansion fits with our small-town, big-heart values. But it's also in our own self-interest to pull in that federal money to pay for services that we're currently paying for on our own. Finally, taking money out of the highway fund and putting it to other purposes, it just must immediately stop. So, end the income tax exemption, invest in schools, expand Medicaid eligibility, stop stealing from the highway fund. That's a starting to-do list. There are lots of other things to do too. And those things will follow if we get our values right. If we're investing in education and good highways and keeping a big heart, that will take us a long way. It's already brought Kansas a long way. And those values need to be the focus of the state budget again. One final thought. The responsibility to change things lies with all of us. It's time for all of us to give our lawmakers the what for and fix the disconnect between our values and the misguided set of budget priorities that we currently have in Kansas. Thank you so much for taking a bit of your evening to listen to a budget talk. And I would be very happy to try to answer any questions that you might have, or also pleased to hear whatever comments that any of you might have. I think if you have questions, you're encouraged to come down to one of the microphones so that everyone can hear.
I'm a state employee, but one of my concerns is if we stay the course that we're at right now, and is it going to be that K-12 in our colleges is going to be privatized?
Well, we're already on a path in higher education to essentially, we're on that privatized path right now. The amount of money that comes from the state to higher education, to K-State, it's shrinking. And other sources of revenue to run places like K-State, tuition, fees, other kinds of resources, those are the ones going up. And yes, in our current financial situation, we can't think of putting more money into higher education. We can't think of increasing money to K-12. We're involved in trying to pull it all back and make it smaller. We can't think about making it grow or getting better until we change that outlook, until we make the focus of our budget prudently and appropriately funding schools and education and highways. Until we do that, we're in a downsizing, cutback mode and not moving into the future.
I'm a lifelong Kansan. I've watched state government for a long time, including the time when you were in the legislature, when you and actually were responsible public servants in the legislature. Seems like a lifetime ago. My question to you is this. I don't disagree with any of your to-do list, and it'd be great if it happened tomorrow, but I think you're, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but I think the solutions that you're offering, the to-do list, are years away. And I think the damage that's been done to this state can't be turned around for years to come, maybe a generation. So if you've got an audience of college students here, people who aspire to be public school teachers or in civil service, why would they stay in Kansas, to start out their career? What's outside of a love for the state, something of that nature? I mean, just in career choices, why stay in this state?
There is a lot to love about Kansas. It's a beautiful place.
I haven't left yet.
Right.
Why, if you're starting out teaching and you have gone through and watched through the media or seen firsthand the disrespect that the state government has, why think that that's going to turn around anytime in the next few years or even the next 10 years?
Many of us have grown to love Kansas very much. But I agree with you that what has happened in just a few short years now has been disastrous and has taken our state back a long way, and it's likely going to take a long time to correct it and turn it around. Now, more and more lawmakers are realizing that what has happened has not worked. Even some very conservative lawmakers have begun to understand that the business income exemption is just not working and has been a mistake. And I think there are hopeful signs that and some of these other things can be contemplated, but it is going to require that those of us who really understand our deep Kansas values, it's going to require us to really push on our lawmakers, on the ones who understand, and to give them backbone, and probably to change some of them who have put these policies in place. And I believe that there's some hope that that can happen. I don't know that that happens quickly, but especially that survey from the Kansas Speaks survey from the Docking Institute really indicated that there is a disconnect between the way most Kansans feel and the way the majority of our lawmakers have been operating. And we have to find a way to solve that disconnect. And I don't want to be completely pessimistic that that can happen, but I agree with you that it probably is going to take some time. Hi.
Okay, so you've talked about how we need to fix this disconnect. And I think one thing I can say for myself and probably a lot of the other college students here is that we've grown up seeing the government sort of fail. And it feels like a lot of us have lost faith in that. And I know there's not a lot of interest in going into any sort of career in the government or in the public sector. It's like we want more of that hands-on approach of like, I want to go be a teacher and actually see sort of that return. So how do you suggest that we remediate this disconnect if we don't have this interest in going into a government job?
I don't think you necessarily need to go into a government job to get rid of this disconnect, but you need to pay attention to what is happening within government. It certainly is affecting public schools, it's affecting teachers, and it's terribly important to understand who your lawmakers are and what they're doing, and tracking, connecting, do our Kansas values track with what my lawmaker is doing? And if they don't, it's very important to get involved to either replace or push that lawmaker in a different direction.
So how do you do that? 'Cause I don't know, like, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but correct me if I'm wrong, everyone else, but I feel like we don't, like, I just don't know how to do that.
There are actually quite a few people here in the room who can help you, and I think there's a leadership center, leadership studies at K-State that would, I think, happily engage with you on those kinds of topics. But I'm glad that you're searching for that and trying to find a way to do it, because it's terribly important. And those of you coming into the economic system now are the ones who have the most at stake.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you comment on a Kansas City Star article today that says that in October about $15 million below expectations, the state revenue department announced, and that for the 2016 fiscal year are now $57 million below estimate?
Mm-hmm.
How serious are those figures?
Well, it's...
Do you believe those figures?
Yes. Yeah. The current fiscal year started July 1. And in July, August, September, and October, each month, revenue has come in below expectations. Even though the state raised the sales tax, even though the state raised cigarette taxes, the hoped-for revenue is not coming in, which means that right now, Kansas does not have enough revenue to fund the expenses that were placed in the budget for this year. Something is going to have to happen before the end of this fiscal year to balance things out. There's the money in the bank is gone. We don't have any savings, and revenue, based on this most recent month now, revenue is below the amount that the state has decided to spend or approved to spend, even though that spending it's very conservative and cut back in many programs. Something will have to give before the end of this fiscal year. That's not a good way to live financially. We are living essentially from paycheck to paycheck, very, very unable to look forward because we aren't getting enough money to fund even the conservative set of things that we've agreed to fund. This Friday, revenue estimators for the state are going to meet, and they're going to revise the revenue estimates that the state is currently operating under, and almost certainly they will revise the revenue expectations downward. And at the end of that meeting, it'll be clear that Kansas isn't expecting enough revenue to fund the current budget, so something's going to happen. There are several lawmakers in the room, and I don't envy them the job that they have as they go back to Topeka in January, because they're going to have to find ways to fix up the current situation. We shouldn't be in this kind of a situation. We should actually have a balance. We should have savings in the bank. That's how most states function. The average state keeps at least 7 or 8% of expenditures, an amount equal to 7 or 8% of expenditures in the bank or in a rainy day fund. Kansas has 0. If we would keep even 7.5% of our expenditures in savings, which is what our state law actually says we're supposed to do, we'd have $500 million in the bank now, but we have 0. We're just scraping by. So it's serious. And ultimately, what I'm really trying to convey is that because we're in that situation, all of our energy goes to just figuring out how to get by. We don't look forward. We don't think about how to invest. We're in a downsize mode, not in a future mode. And it's terribly important to fix that.
Thanks, Duane. Can you talk a little bit about the constitutional crisis that's facing Kansas? Hasn't Governor Brownback threatened the court system, threatened our entire third branch of government over their decisions over educational funding?
Well, there have been a variety of things going on with between branches of government. One of them is that the way the courts have been budgeted this year is that their budget is actually subject to a decision or decisions that they might make. And if they make the decision wrongly, supposedly, then the money to actually fund the court system goes away. And that situation is currently traveling through the court system, and it's at play right now. Another key issue between the courts and the legislature and governor is the funding of schools. There is a court case going right now which looks at whether our schools are constitutionally adequately and equitably funded. And that case, it's a little hard to say exactly when that might come to full bloom, so to speak, but probably there are going to be arguments this month, and probably sometime next spring, maybe we'll see a Supreme Court ruling on that in Kansas. But it's almost unimaginable to think that the state might win that lawsuit or win that court case, in which case we're probably headed towards a situation where the court says you must put more money into schools in some way. And the state has none. And we don't know how that might work out. But there are some very conflictual situations headed our way as between the branches of government given these situations.
I really thought that I might just sit here and listen to you. Former colleague, Duane and I served together in the legislature, and as I look at your message, many of us here know this to be true. I think you really have presented it in such a way for others to understand just what the critical situation is. But I want to point out whether we have with us former governor in the audience, we have city commissioners, county commission folks, public servants.
Sitting legislators.
I was going to talk about those two,
sorry.
the current lawmakers. They are not our problem. They
Agreed.
understand this. And Representative Tom Phillips and Representative Sidney Carlin are here tonight, and they need help in Topeka. And why has this happened? Why are the lawmakers lockstep, a majority of them doing this? Because we have a governor who helped get them elected. And the governor is setting the agenda, and the lawmakers that he has helped are the ones moving it forward and saying yes. So when the young lady over here asked about how to make a difference, you need to find out what your folks at home are doing, for your legislators. And there are some, I agree with you, Duane, that can be emboldened and maybe cross the governor and the leadership, knowing that they're going to have committee assignments jerked, or other things are going to happen to their political lives in Topeka. But the rising up of Kansans to say our values matter more than your trip to Topeka, and really work hard to find out, number one, what your legislators are doing, and number two, get people to run against them, get them out, and get some people in there who really care about Kansas.
Thanks, Lana. That's a nice closing.
Thank you, Mr. Goossen, and thank you all for coming out despite major construction and parades in Kansas City to learn more about this critical topic. So thank you very much. Thank you.
You are good.